If we gave the Larrys this much concrete proof, we'd never hear the end of it. Hi. Oh my God. Okay, welcome back. Long time no see. I have nothing to update you on. My name is Carly. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about possibly my favorite conspiracy of all time, like ever, I would say. If you didn't know, because you're a fake fan and you're a fake fucking friend, I have a podcast. It's called Girl Historians, and every single season, which is like 10 episodes or whatever, we'll go over a different topic. We started out with the Titanic, we did the Salem witch trials, we did Princess Diana. Right now we're doing one on the ex-wives of Henry VIII, like Anne Boleyn and all that. But we also did a season about the Beatles this summer. And while doing it, I fell so deep down a rabbit hole because my friend Sarah would constantly send me, while I was researching for the Beatles episodes, edits of like modern Beatle fans making edits on TikTok and stuff like that. Cause like the Beatles are obviously a band from like the 60s, but there are like modern fans that are young women making like edits on TikTok and like gift sets on Tumblr and posts on Instagram. Like it's very interesting to me. Like I think it's like interesting to think about like fans in the modern day who are fans of a band that existed in the 60s of like 20-year-olds, and half of them are dead and the other half are, how old are they? In their 70s or 80s? It's interesting to me. I enjoyed it. So I oftentimes would go down the rabbit hole just for myself about modern Beatles fans, and I came across, is it a conspiracy theory? Larry Stylinson in its earliest form, one of the earliest gay ships. A rose by any different name would still smell just as sweet, but what it is McLennon. Now, stay with me. Come along for this ride with me. McLennon is a ship of Beatles members, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. And it's not, as with a lot of times when we ship real people, it's very like Larry Stylinson adjacent, I said before, which is the ship between Louis Tomlinson and Harry Styles for One Direction, in that it's not just a ship, it's a group of people who are convinced that these two people were actually together. You know, it diverts from basic fan behavior online of shipping people, of just wanting them to be together, writing fanfic about them being together, you know, enjoying shipping Harry and Draco and Harry Potter. There's a difference between that and people who are shipping to people while also collecting information that they think are clues or breadcrumbs or proof that these two people that they're shipping were physically together. I find it fascinating. I don't think anyone cares but me. I feel like this video will do bad. Like, I don't think it's gonna go well, but I need to talk about it because I'm obsessed with it. I touched on McLennon a little bit in our podcast episode, The Beatles' Messiest Moments. If you want to listen to that and also some other crazy things that happened in the Beatles' time. I will say, I think it is genuinely one of the best episodes of the podcast. Like, no lie, it is wild. I also think people in the past who were famous could just act way more out of pocket and crazier than they could now. Like, everybody is jumping down Chappell Roan's throat for yelling at a rude paparazzi when, like, in the 70s, George Harrison of the Beatles made, like, consistent jokes about buying a child. Like, we simply, if we can't handle Chappell Roan, we definitely cannot handle rock stars of the 70s, you know? So it's a really interesting and funny episode if you want to listen to that. Or if you want to get more context for the Beatles, you can listen to any of the episodes from that season. It's really interesting. We can walk you through like Beatlemania, their rise to fame, all these different things. I am going to give you a bit of context of the Beatles for this video because I think you need it to understand McLennon. Because basically what I'm going to do today is walk you through chronologically the thought process of McLennon, the proof that the people who ship McLennon point to. So if you run a McLennon blog on Tumblr, couldn't have done it without you, girl. Thank you so much. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go down the timeline of different events and instances that either point to McLennon or, like, I'm trying to think of the word for this. It doesn't really exist, but it's like events in the Beatles timeline that are canon that happened, but viewed through the McLennon lens. You know what I mean? Like when the Beatles broke up, people are like, oh, it's because of Yoko. I hate women. I wish all women would die. That's what you sound like if you say that. But in actuality, what do McLennon shippers think broke up the Beatles? Stuff like that. It's going to be a listicle for your BuzzFeed pilled brains. Don't worry. Fold some laundry, eat your dinner, zone out while the beautiful lilting tones of my low voice lull you to sleep. I don't care, but let's get into it, okay? So first things first, who are the Beatles? I'm just gonna give you a very quick overview of who they are if you don't know, or you don't know like the specific information I need you to know so I can explain to you why people think John Lennon and Paul McCartney were gay for each other, right? I should probably add a disclaimer here saying that reading this proof, I went in being like, yeah, okay, and then read the proof and was like, oh, like it's compelling. It's kind of the same thing as whenever you read Larry Stylinson facts and you're like, I don't think they were together. But then when I read this Tumblr timeline, there's no such thing as coincidence. Just a quick disclaimer on that part of being like, it is compelling. We'll never really know what truly happened. Also, like when we're talking about people who were queer in the 60s, bad time to be gay, bad time to be queer, not a very like open view of sexuality. I would say like now, but actually the world is falling apart, so maybe it's the same, I don't know. And also when we talk about shipping real people, there's a lot of like ethical concerns. I also think it's interesting, like, yes, we shouldn't ship real people, but like, what if they're dead? Do you know what I mean? Like, John Lennon is dead. Spoiler alert. Sorry. Sorry to break the news to you in the year of our Lord 2024 that John Lennon was assassinated, but he was. We'll get to it. It's in the McLennon lore. Don't you worry. I don't know what the ethical implications are of shipping real people when one of them is dead, and also the other one surely does not have access to the internet. Like, Paul McCartney is not scrolling on TikTok. He's got bigger fish to fry. But before we talk about the relationship between Paul and John, let's first talk about the holidays. You know, speaking of loved ones and relationships, the holidays are around the corner. Smooth segue. The holidays mean that it's time for you to indulge in a gift that keeps on giving. And Lelo is here to help. Lelo is a luxury sex toy brand that wants to help you discover what you like and help reignite or ignite that passion within you. If you've been here before, I've worked with them a bunch. I think that their toys and products are fantastic. And this Black Friday, Lelo is offering incredible deals, all on their premium pleasure toys, offering you double the pleasure and savings for a limited time only. One of my favorite Lelo toys is the Enigma Double Sonic. And this Black Friday, it is available at a discount for the first time ever. Thank you. The Enigma Double Sonic is an A-spot vibrator. Your A-spot is deeper than your G-spot, and stimulating it induces a different and very, very intense orgasm. The Enigma Double Sonic targets the A-spot, which is hard to reach, and helps stimulate it so you can experience emotional relief and a different kind of orgasm. And it looks like a Bond weapon. Said lovingly, I think it looks amazing. It's very sleek, very chic. If this sounds good to you, go to the link in my description below and use the code UncarlyLelo20 for an additional 20% off. So it's savings on top of your savings. It's double savings. You're making money at that point. If you think about the mental health improvements and impacts made by orgasm, you're actually just making money. I don't make up the rules. Thank you so much to Lelo for sponsoring. Let's talk about the Beatles. I'm looking here if I need to read some stuff because I'm so bad with dates that I'll tell you that like the Beatles formed in 1816 out of pocket for no reason, so I have to read it or I'll say it wrong. The Beatles are an English rock band. They formed in Liverpool in 1960 and disbanded in 1970. That's kind of crazy. They've only been together for 10 years. They've formed when a lot of them were like teenagers, like 15 to 17. They're primarily working class. The Beatles made music as like a means of escape, right? Like they lived in this working class community. They wanted to make music so they could tour the world, see the world, and kind of like escape from the assumed roles that they'll take after they graduate school. They've written all your dad's favorite songs and all of my favorite songs. I will say, doing an entire podcast series about the Beatles has made me a Beatles defender. Not in like an ironic way, but it's funny to be like, have you ever heard of this niche indie band They're called the Beatles. But then you like listen to the Beatles songs and you're like, these songs are so good. Like, why the are they so fucking good? Like, why is every single song, why is every album good? Maybe not the one that they wrote. They have an album that they wrote for Cirque du Soleil that's just kind of like weird instrumental compilations of their songs, which is pretty bad. It's called The Beatles Love. And I don't think we need a Beatles Cirque du Soleil trapeze show. Why must we play God? That's my cultural Frankenstein's monster. All that's to say, they were incredibly influential on like modern pop music. If you listen to a lot of early Beatles songs, obviously like every single white artist, just like stealing aspects of blues and rock and roll from Black culture, but popularizing it. So there's no way around that. There's no way to say that. That doesn't sound bad. It sounds bad. But they were incredibly influential in pop culture, became an international sensation, and also like was very influential on youth culture because they were very, very popular with young people to such an extent that businesses and like corporations started to see that they could really make money tapping into youth culture. Okay. They are made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. John and Paul, those are the ones we're going to be talking about today. They were the main songwriters and they wrote basically every song together. They were very like strong artistic partners. And if you look basically at any Beatles song that is written by either John Lennon or Paul McCartney, it just says Lennon and McCartney. So even if one basically wrote the entirety of the song, they would share the credit for every single one of them. That's suspicious. That's weird. Something that I think is really interesting about the fact that people ship John and Paul together. The parallels between Larry for me are really, really interesting because when the Beatles became famous, there was a thing called Beatlemania where they were incredibly, incredibly popular. It was like One Direction Infection or Bieber Fever, but like for the 1960s. They would perform live shows and couldn't hear themselves over girls screaming. They would get swarmed. There's a video of Paul McCartney playing a concert like recently with a woman fully in her 60s, holding a sign being like, when I was 12, I tried to mail myself to you. Just crazy, crazy fans. The girls would piss themselves in the seats of the show. Okay, sure, girl. Fine. But I just think it's interesting that we see shipping almost as like something that's very popular with teenagers becomes very, very popular. It's given that the men involved in it are going to be shipped in some way or another. And now that's being like put on the Beatles, but like retroactively. I just think it's interesting. Okay, so that's context. We're going to talk about their early life, like how they met and how they trauma bonded. And then we'll get into just like reasons, if that makes sense. Okay. Again, not going to get super in depth. If you're interested to just learn more about like the early life of the Beatles, we have a full episode about that on the podcast if you're interested. These are the cliff notes. Okay. So John and Paul met when they were playing as a part of a band called the Quarrymen, and this was in 1957, 3 years before the Beatles formed. They just kind of like started vibing. They connected over wanting to write music and play music, and they wanted to form a separate band together. John is 2 years older than Paul, and Paul was always like, John was so cool. He was a little bit richer than the rest of the Beatles. Like he was being raised by his like rich aunt, so they were like, whoa, he's like chic. And Paul was just very talented musically, and John was drawn to that. So they decide to form a band. Paul brings in George Harrison on the guitar. George is the youngest Beatle. He's 2 years younger than Paul, but he's just really, really good at guitar, and they needed somebody who's good at guitar, so they bring him in. And then they add a drummer that they know from like the Liverpool music scene named Pete Best. Now you might be like, who the is Pete Best? He's not famous, and it's because he was too handsome to be in the band, so they fired him and hired Ringo Starr, who you definitely know because he's actually famous. Now, I think that there's a lot you can really learn from Ringo in terms of like, if you can get your ego to die just enough that you're fine with being hired because you're uglier than the person you're replacing, you can go far in life. Like if you can just jump over the hurdle of people being like, we're hiring you because the person that you're replacing is hot and we don't with that. We actually want somebody who's ugly like you. If you can jump over that hurdle, you can go far. That's the Ringo Starr way, baby. So they form a band, the Beatles, you might have heard of them. They start playing. John and Paul decide to start writing their own songs. And they bond a lot over that because basically every day after school, they're getting together and they're writing songs together, creating this very like beautiful, beautiful creative partnership. They also bond over trauma, the best way to bond, the most healthy way to bond, a bond that isn't codependent and steeped in mental illness and grief, just tier 1 way to bond. Up here, trauma. Here, corporate bonding with your coworkers. And then like down here is like regular bonding. Who gives a that sucks. In 1956, so before John and Paul met, Paul's mother died from complications of a surgery after she was diagnosed with breast cancer. So Paul lost his mother. He was, 14? Yeah, horrible to imagine. Just traumatic. And then in 1958, 2 years later, John's mother dies when she is hit by a car outside the family home. John is being raised by his aunt, his mom's sister, but his mom is heavily involved in his life as well. Gets hit by a car. So they both bond over the loss of their mother figures early in life as well. So already before they become famous and kind of like, fame isolates you from regular life. So you're going to be bonded by that experience as well. They're already trauma bonded and bonded by writing all these songs together. After that, the Beatles form. Before they start touring and cutting a record, they go to Berlin and play a bunch of clubs from 1960 to 1961. They're away from home. There's a lot of weird stories that Paul McCartney will offer up out of pocket in like a GQ interview in like 2021, being like, when we were all in Berlin, we would jerk off together and then see who could come first. That's not any of the facts that we have here. I mean, we don't have time to unpack all of that, but Paul McCartney offers up that information that in these Berlin years and the early years of them touring, all 4 Beatles off together constantly. Sorry, if I know that, you have to know that. And then years after the Beatles break up, spoiler alert, John Lennon writes a 1-act play about all the Beatles jerking off, and who edited that play, who helped him write that play, who told him to write that play? Yoko Ono. Okay, moving on. The first major point of proof that McLennon shippers look to, kind of point to say, that's suspicious, that's weird, was the birthday trip of 1961. In June of 1961, Paul and John take a best friend's birthday trip for Paul's 21st birthday. Yes, the 21st birthday. So in the previous year, they were playing clubs in Berlin. For Paul's birthday, they're taking a break. And what they want to do is they want to hitchhike from England to Spain. I know that this is very North American of me. I know that there's a tunnel you could take from England to Spain, right? Or a train from England to France. There's a tunnel. I know that logically. I assume it was made in the 60s because otherwise, what the f is your plan? To hitchhike across open water, but go off. They hitchhike, they're supposed to go to Spain, they get lazy, and they end up just spending a couple of weeks in Paris, okay? Now, this is the first time we really get McLennon content. They take a bunch of film photographs of each other and together. They get little matching haircuts like the mop tops that the Beatles end up having for years when they play on the Ed Sullivan Show and get very famous. They're wearing little leather jackets and taking pictures together and then taking funny photos of them in bowler hats because they were like, wouldn't it be so funny if we took a best friend hitchhiking trip to Paris because we're best friends, we're bros, and then while we're hitchhiking, we're wearing bowler hats. Isn't that funny? They write songs, poems, stories together. They just kind of hang out. They're also staying in one hotel room and sharing a bed, which, we love. So, you can see some of these photos, this is of the time. A lot of old Beatles photos, people recolorize, which I don't care for. I think it looks kind of weird, but they're the ones that are higher quality than the black and white ones that are uploaded to a Beatles Facebook page and are approximately 4 pixels. So that's what I have to show you here. This photo of John Lennon sleeping in their shared hotel bed, allegedly, according to an interview with, I believe, one of the Beatles producers, said that Paul McCartney had this hung in his house for a long time. Love that. After the Beatles break up, Paul McCartney forms another band called Wings. Sorry for the spoiler alert that the Beatles broke up. It's history. We're going to get to that as well. I'm a Wings defender. I'll stand on guard defending Wings till the day I die. People say that they make shitty music. I think that's wrong. I do think that Paul McCartney has written one of the worst Christmas songs known to man. I think that he will pay for his crimes for writing Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas Time. I think it's actually horrific. But I think Wings has good songs, and I will stand by that. In 1977, 7 years after the Beatles broke broke up. Wings released a song called Cafe on the Left Bank that is about this trip. So you do the math there. 16 years later, it's just a song, you know, looking back on this trip. It's like written like 5 or 6 years after they basically stopped talking for a long time. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, we see a lot of this in Paul's music after the Beatles break up and after his relationship with John deteriorates, is a lot of him like looking back wistfully on times he deems to be better times. Okay. Also, John wrote a short story about this trip. It was published in, I believe, either a zine or there was a book that he later released with Yoko called like Imagine, I believe. But you can find it online if you look it up. So the short story is no way to beat around the bush. Not very good. But it's about an unnamed narrator that has sex with a woman in Paris. You know, kind of like the first short story that any guy writes in a short story workshop. He's like, what if a man had sex with a woman? Thoughts on that? If they're feeling really spicy, they're like, and she's a sex worker, but get this, she acts normal. Anyways, that's what the story is about, but it's basically a retelling of their trip to Paris, except it's not John and Paul, it's an unnamed narrator having sex with a woman. But the woman's name is Amélie Nitrate. Horrible French accent, but you get the point. Kind of a strange name, and it's strange because Amélie Nitrate is just what Poppers is. So the main character of the story has sex with a woman, but the woman's name is Poppers. Her name is basically Poppers, which it could be nothing. Which could be nothing. It could be nothing. The next piece of McLennon proof that the shippers point to is the Valentine's Day card. In February of 1963, John gives Paul a Valentine's Day card. Okay, love that. Now, the reason we know that this happened is because John gives Paul the Valentine's Day card, but then he is struck by inspiration and they're together, takes the card back and writes the lyrics to If I Fell, which is a Beatles song from Help, I believe, on the back of the card. So we can see the Valentine's Day card that he gave to Paul because it has the lyrics of If I Fell written on the back. And it's like in the Beatles archive. Do you know what I like? Because people are like, oh my God, look, this is like when they wrote the lyrics to that song. I need to read you these lyrics because they are wild. If I fell in love with you, would you promise to be true and help me understand? Because I've been in love before and I found that love was more than just holding hands. If I give my heart to you, I must be sure that from the very start that you would love me more than her. If we gave the Larrys this much concrete proof, we'd never hear the end of it. This next section, we are going to talk about a real instance that a lot of McLennon shippers and also just kind of people who believe that John Lennon was queer point to as proof that John Lennon was queer, bisexual, something of that nature. Now, I'm a truther on this. The main reason I am a truther is because Yoko Ono, John Lennon's second wife, queen, icon, legend, is she heavily problematic? Absolutely. But I have to defend her because misogynists hate her. It's like, I don't want to be backed in this corner. It's like when people are like, I hate Amy Schumer. And I'm like, me too, but I don't think for the reasons you hate her. Yoko Ono has said in an interview in 2015, husband has been dead for what, 35 years at that point? She has said, John and I had a big talk about it, saying basically all of us must be bisexual. And we were sort of in a situation of thinking we're not, because of society. So we are hiding the other side of ourselves, which is less acceptable. I think he had a desire to have sex with men, but I think he was too inhibited. No, not inhibited. He said, I don't mind if there's an incredibly attractive guy. It's very difficult. They would have to not just be physically attractive, but mentally very advanced too, and you can't find people like that. Weird thing at the end of being like, the only reason I'm not bi is because I can't find men that are hot and smart. But, you know, I think that obviously our ideas of sexuality in the modern day are very, very different than like what people would have experienced in the 60s and 70s, right? That's kind of like a given. But I do think this quote from Yoko, while out of pocket, just love to out my dead husband, in 2015. I think that this quote is very interesting because I think that this conversation kind of like, it's like the Kinsey scale. Do you know what I mean? Of being like people having this conversation of saying, I think that a lot of us have are bi, or at least people have this capacity for queerness. Love is constantly growing and evolving and fluid. They didn't say that because this was the 60s, right? The 70s. But we understand this to be true now. And we all have this capacity. And I think that that open-minded, very fluid view of sexuality, I agree with, I subscribe to. And I think if you're thinking about that and talking to that, then you do have this capacity for queerness, or at least understanding that you do have the capacity, that you could be, right? So I'm a truther. But the event that people who ship McLennon and who think that John Lennon is gay often point to is his holiday with Brian Epstein. Now, here's my question. If I say Epstein because I'm talking about the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, will I get demonetized because they're thinking I'm talking about Epstein? We'll find out. And there's only one way to know. So Brian Epstein is the Beatles manager. He discovered them when they were living in Liverpool. I love Brian Epstein. He was a gay man and he was out in the sense that you could be in the 60s, you know? The band knew he was gay, industry knew he was gay, but obviously different rules for safety in the past. We can't get into all of Brian Epstein. You should read about him. It is nuts. Like, he basically invented the modern way of selling pop acts as like youth culture, because up until that point, people were managed by these much older industry professionals. They weren't managed by a peer, but he was around the same age as the Beatles. He had his finger on the pulse of youth culture, and he was able to sell the Beatles by being like, I know what is cool to young people, and I'm telling you that this is it. Icon, legend. We love Brian Epstein in this house. Okay? So as I said before, the Beatles knew that Brian was gay. If you watch Hard Day's Night, the Beatles movie, there's a lot of like weird kind of like, it's not overt, but to me, it's very much like double entendre allusions to like John hating Brian, but like wanting to sexually dominate him. But it's like played for a joke. It's played for a laugh. Also, John wrote rich man, like, oh, you're a rich man, for Brian Epstein, because when you play it live, it sounds like, oh, you're a rich F slur. You know, how you write a song for one of your closest friends. You write a song that when you play it live, it sounds like you're calling them a slur. There's a lot to be said about John Lennon. You cannot argue that he is not a heavily complicated individual. Obviously, he had complicated relationships with queerness. There's the Yoko Ono quote that I just referenced before. There are also crazy pictures with him, Yoko, and Andy Warhol that just, you cannot tell me this does not look like they just had a threesome. This is a throuple. Like, you cannot, they look like they're a throuple in these pictures. It's odd. It looks like these are three people. They're going to shuffle across the dance floor, all three of them, and say, like, we saw you, we love your vibe. They're looking for a unicorn. Also, in I don't think it's Bowie's official biography, but in some kind of like unofficial biography, the writer says that David Bowie told him that David Bowie and John Lennon had a threesome, and then the girl left, and they just kept going. So we love that. Let's just actually read the quote word for word. This is what David Bowie said. So he's going to use some misogynist language, and I want you to know that it's not me. I'm just parroting David Bowie. There was a whore in the middle, and she, I think she was a she, not that we would have minded, left, and we kept going. That was during the Lost Weekend, which we will get to later, which was basically this 18-month period from late 1973 to early 1975 in which John Lennon and Yoko Ono were separated. He dated the couple's assistant and just kind of went on these like crazy drug benders, okay? Also, love the drama of just like naming periods of your life, being like, this is the Lost Weekend. I've decided that this is the Lost Weekend. It's 18 months, but it's a weekend if you really think about it, because it's and it's lost. So that's kind of John Lennon's relationship with queerness, or a lot of references. We can get to that. On April 28th, 1963, Brian Epstein and John Lennon take a 12-day bestie friend trip to Barcelona, you can decide. Now, there's a couple of things about this trip that are, I raise an eyebrow at. The first being that, so they leave on April 28th. On April 8th, 20 days before, John Lennon's current wife, Cynthia Lennon, gave birth to their first son. And you know how, like, when you give birth to your son, your husband takes a 12-day trip basically immediately afterwards and just kind of, like, leaves you alone. You know how you do that? It's like such a trash move. I can't believe it. It's just a fun wrinkle, okay? So They go on this 12-day trip to Barcelona. In a 1970 interview, John Lennon says, "I was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain, where rumors ran around that he and I were having a love affair. Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated, but it was a pretty intense relationship. It was my first experience with a homosexual that I was conscious was homosexual. He had admitted it to me. We had this holiday together because Sin was pregnant. She gave birth." John, let's talk about the dates. "And I went to Spain, and there were lots of funny stories. We used to sit in a cafe at Torremolinos looking at all the boys, and I'd say, 'Do you like that one? Do you like that one?' In John Lennon's biography, John Lennon, My Life, he said, 'What happened is that Epi kept on and on at me until one night I finally pulled me trousers down and said to him, "Oh, for Christ's sake, Brian, just stick it up me f***ing ass then." And he said to me, "Actually, John, I don't do that kind of thing. That's not what I like to do." "Well," I said, "what is it you like to do then?" And he said, "I'd really like to touch you, John," and I let him toss me off. What's really interesting about the Beatles and like older rock stars is like you would assume that a lot of this is hearsay, but a lot of it is just in like official biographies or interviews from their friends that are like, "Yeah, that happened. Yeah, that happened. Yeah, it happened." So that's the holiday with Brian Epstein and John Lennon's relationship with his own queerness. I think that stuff is genuinely very interesting. Now let's move on to the cats, okay? So the Beatles did a lot of movies. I had to do a lot of research on this when I was researching for the podcast because they were like, I didn't like understand them. Didn't make any sense to me. They would make movies where they would play kind of heightened versions of themselves, or it would be a concert movie, or it would be like a lot of sketches and like a live concert, but it'd be like with other bands and they'd play backup. I didn't really understand it. And then I realized that I think these movies basically don't exist anymore because they fulfill the same service that social media does, in that they provide fans with access to the band's personality in a greater level, right? Like you don't need a movie where the band is playing versions of themselves if they just kind of do that on social media every single day, right? That's what I think, because I did not understand like why these movies existed. It made no sense to me. And in 1964, the Beatles released Around the Beatles, which is a television special. It's taped at Wembley Stadium. It has sketches, the Beatles perform songs, and other acts perform songs. The Beatles sing backup for them, that kind of thing. One of the sketches is a play on Pyramus and Thisbe. I did not know before I was researching this. I believe it's like a Greek tragedy that Romeo and Juliet are based off of. It's basically star-crossed lovers that can't be together, so they die, right? I couldn't believe I found this picture. I was like, I actually killed it. So Paul is playing Pyramus. John is playing Thisbe in drag. Fun wrinkle is George is the moon. You know, the moon, and Ringo is a lion. It seems nuts. It seems like a wild choice for the Beatles to do, but I'm obsessed with it. Now, this alone can be like a little like, that's suspicious, but it could mean nothing. They just played star-crossed lovers in a sketch for their live television special. Okay, that can almost be like the same vibe as, you know, when like the football players at your high school would like dress in drag for like some kind of like talent show, and everyone would be like, that's so funny, because they're not. Or they would like kiss and you'd be like, oh my God, but they're not, because to be that would be embarrassing. It could be along those same lines of just kind of like problematic, you know what I mean. But after this, John buys 2 cats, names them Pyramus and Thisbe, and then gives Thisbe, the character that he plays, to Paul as a gift. And there's like photos of Paul with Thisbe. Thisbe has a litter of cats that Paul and Linda McCartney have long into their lives. It's interesting. Another short incident is that in 1965, John Lennon gets drunk and is asked to sign autographs, and he signs his name John McCartney. I mean, I can't read this. Like, this is again another big point of proof for McLennon shippers. I mean, I trust Beatles fans to be able to read their handwriting and signature more than I. This could be anything. This could be my name. I could not tell you. It looks like a scribble, but that's interesting. I do think, obviously, signing your name with your crush's last name is kind of a point of a rite of passage for whipped motherfuckers everywhere. Now let's talk about Linda, Yoko, and India. This is going to be a big section because we're covering a lot of ground. This is less like, here's a point of proof, and more like, let's talk about the later relationships of Paul and John and the breakup of the Beatles. So Paul eventually ends up marrying Linda, John ends up marrying Yoko, but prior to that, their relationships, I don't want to say they're not as serious, but they definitely were not as intense. The band took precedence. Their relationships and the creative work of the band, because they're writing songs this entire time through, right, are the number one priority of the band members. They have a rule that girlfriends and wives are not allowed in the studio. It's a sacred place where they're creating, okay? And McLennon shippers kind of posit that once Paul gets with Linda, it's kind of over for their relationship because that relationship is so intense. And if you remember, Paul and John kind of trauma bonded and were fairly codependent. John fears abandonment and gets with Yoko because he's afraid of being abandoned by Paul. And then that kind of like Paul's avoidant attachment style and John's anxious attachment style kind of just like trigger each other over and over again until the relationship breaks down. Again, we have no way of knowing if this is true, but I think it is interesting. I do think whether or not they were together, I do think that John Lennon seemingly had a lot of abandonment issues on account of the fact that his father abandoned him, his mother died. Paul has a very consistent relationship in his life, and we all have had those feelings of when your friend gets into like a very, very like big relationship and you're like, oh, my ass is about to be left behind. A couple of quotes that I think are interesting is that Yoko said during the Revolution tapes, so like the bonus kind of content that they made for Revolution. I'm sure that if he had been a woman or something, this is Paul she's talking about, he would have been a great threat because there's something definitely very strong between me and John and Paul. In John Lennon, The Life, Yoko Ono is again quoted saying, I thought John was cheating on me with Paul. Cynthia Lennon, John Lennon's first wife, the one that he abandoned to go on his bestie's Spain trip with Brian Epstein, said, John never looked at anyone the way he looked at Paul. And this is a big kind of like quote for, I don't know why I'm putting that in quotations, it is. This is a big quote for McLennon shippers. You can find a lot of photos, videos where John is like, looking at Paul like that. It's very touching. I think regardless of their relation, the details of their relationship, they really, really loved each other and had like a very, very close relationship and really respected each other. I often wonder, I don't know if anybody else feels this way, that if I was like a really famous celebrity, like would my friendly behavior with my friends, could that be interpreted in like a shipping way? Do you know what I mean? Like if I was as famous as the Beatles, or if I was in One Direction, could people clip just a photo or a video of me listening to my friend talking and be like, oh my God, she is so in love with them. She is so whipped. I often think about that. There's no way to know because I'm not famous, but I think that is an interesting wrinkle, okay? So let's talk about India. Not the country, but kind of, because the Beatles took a trip to India that is basically canon for like one of the breaking points of the band and like kind of a point of no return where they all go to India, they all fight, and then it's kind of the beginning of the end of the Beatles. I'm loving a quote for no fucking reason right now. It is the beginning of the end for the Beatles because they all go and fight. So we can talk about what is kind of generally accepted as happening and also what McLennon shippers kind of think happened on the trip. The Beatles kind of have two eras of songs. They have the early stuff that's very much like, I love my girlfriend, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like, I want to dance with my girlfriend and hold my girlfriend's hand. Then they have songs that are basically along the lines of like, I took acid once and now it's my entire personality. I love it and I'm seated for every single song. So what about it? But it is interesting. This is like a lot of their later influence. They stopped touring so they can make albums that don't have to like be played live, if that makes sense. And also crazy Beatles fact is that John and George, I believe, tried acid for the first time because they were drugged. They were at dinner with their dentist and their dentist put acid in, like unknowingly drugged them with acid. We do not have the full story there. I don't know why the your dentist is drugging you at dinner. First of all, why the are you at dinner with your dentist? Like, there's a lot going on there. So to talk about India, we have to talk about my favorite Beatle, George Harrison. Love that guy. George Harrison, at the end of the 60s, incredibly into psychedelics. All the Beatles do it, but Ringo and Paul don't do it as much as John and George do. Those f***ers love drugs. They are obsessed with drugs. But George is getting into transcendental meditation and learning the sitar and into the healing, what he believes to be the healing effects of psychedelic drugs, okay? You can learn a lot more about this in the Martin Scorsese documentary. I think it's called George Harrison: A Life. Fantastic documentary. Very, very interesting. Beautiful portrait of like this person's life. I love it. So George might be my favorite Beatle. He is not known for having the best taste in company. He was best friends with just an Eric Clapton, who is a Nazi, who also stole George Harrison's wife. Love that. That's crazy. He also introduced people to he brought Charles Manson into the fray. Like he introduced people to Charles Manson. And he introduced the Beatles to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now, he was a transcendental meditation teacher, but in actuality, kind of just like a crook who loves fame and money, loves to actually assault women. Okay? Allegedly. All of this is alleged, guys. I will not be sued by the estate of John Lennon. Yoko, back off. Love you, girl, but back off. I will not be sued by Paul McCartney. Nothing but love and light to you, Paul. Please don't sue me. And I will not be sued by the Maharishi. Absolutely not. Everything is alleged. I'm making this up as I go along. I photoshopped every image in this video, if you're gonna sue me. So in February of 1968, the Beatles go to India to learn about transcendental meditation for a couple of months from the Maharishi. Okay? McLennon shippers think something happened on this trip because when they come back, it's like John and Paul are fucked up. Okay? They go in February. Ringo leaves after 10 days being there. That is Ringo core. To be honest, very Ringo coded. I identify with him in this instance. If I went on a trip with my friends and they all started to fight and also were learning meditation from just like a predator, I'd be like, 10 days, I'm out. I don't want to be here anymore. Paul leaves after a month in March because he has to attend to business matters. George and John stay for another month and only leave when George's wife, Patty Boyd, tells him that the Maharishi is basically trying to make women give him sexual favors, in exchange for his wisdom and stuff like that. And they're like, yeah, we're gonna leave. Random Beatles win. You would expect in the 60s, they'd be like, shut up, be quiet, women, shush. But they're like, we're gonna go. So they leave, they come back to record the White Album, the self-titled Beatles White Album. Vibes are bad. You can really see an artistic split in what Lennon and McCartney are doing at this time. Paul's writing Obla Dee, Obla Da, a song that John hates, but it's a boppy pop song, kind of a continuation on the Beatles formula of pop songs that people like and are easy to listen to, but are good. And John is making unlistenable, weird shit. You can really see the diversion of their creative ideals, which I think kind of spells the end for them. Paul wants to continue to make pop music and John wants to be respected by people, which is always the beginning of the end for any artist. The second they're looking for real respect from their peers, they make crazy choices. It's just make good music. So in May of 1968, okay, they've come back in April. Right? In May of 1968, John and Paul go to New York because they are announcing Apple, which is their recording studio, their recording label that they're making. They go to New York to promote Apple. While they're there, Paul invites Linda Eastman, who is a photographer, to come along with them, and they vibe hard. There are lots of accounts of their meeting in which it's uncomfortable for everyone how hard they're vibing. John, triggered by this immediately. The next day, so they go promote Apple, come back. The next day, John has acid for breakfast, drops a ton of acid, and goes into Apple and announces that he is God. So he might be processing some fear of abandonment here. Next day, he calls up Yoko Ono. Said it before, Yoko, I will defend Yoko Ono with my life, even though she has made some bad choices. Because I have to. Because of the she was put through, because people claim she broke up the Beatles, the misogyny and racism that she faced. We can't fully unpack. We talk about it a bit in the episode for my podcast about Yoko. It's a crazy amount of misogyny and racism she has to deal with. So I have to defend her. So this is in 1968. right? In 1966, John is still with Cynthia, and he meets Yoko Ono at an art exhibition for her art. She's a performance artist and a conceptual artist. She's like an inspiration for like the B-52s and like Maria Abramovich. She's influential, and I think just like does not get her artistic due because of her association with John Lennon, but basically helped define modern performance art and helped like create the indie sound that we like think of today when we think of alternative and indie music, okay? Yoko Ono, if you have no fans, I am dead. So she's an art exhibition. One of her pieces has a subject climb up a tall ladder and look through a like magnifying glass. And what it says is just yes. John sees this, loves it. They talk, they vibe. She's in a shitty relationship at this point with this man who like divorces her and then hides her daughter from her. It's up. We don't have time to unpack all of it. She is chasing John from this art gallery in 1966, kind of calls him, tries to get together with him, and he's kind of blowing her off. The day after, he drops a ton of acid and goes into Apple to announce that he is God in 1966, 2 years later. He calls Yoko up and has her come to England because Cynthia's away on a trip, and they have sex, they record tape loops. It's a whole thing. Cynthia comes home from this trip eventually and just sees Yoko Ono at the kitchen table in a robe, like, hey. So he calls Yoko Ono up. Basically, some could argue allegedly in reaction to seeing Paul and Linda vibe. And their relationship is intense. It's kind of giving like, oh, you like Linda and you guys are intensely vibing? Well, it's actually me and Yoko are vibing way more than you. We're actually vibing way more than you guys are, so it's actually funny you would even bring it up. During one of the recording sessions, John forces Paul to like listen to a tape recording of Yoko and John having sex. Remember that no girlfriends or wives in the recording studio rule. John breaks that and has Yoko there the whole time. If you want a real Beatles laugh, you can watch Get Back, which is the Peter Jackson documentary about the Beatles where they remaster all of this footage that the Beatles took when they were writing Abbey Road and Let It Be. I watched it a long time ago. It's 6 hours. It's a lot. But Yoko is in the studio like knitting and answering mail, and they're obviously pissed about this. And George Harrison, by the end of like 3 days, has invited seemingly 25 Hare Krishnas into the studio to just sit silently there. Vibes are wild. Like, it's very like British anger of that everybody's just like simmering under the surface, mad at each other, but nobody's fighting. Interesting. So Yoko is just like around all the time. John is including her on a lot of the creative decisions. And like, again, I do think Yoko Ono is an artist in her own right. I don't know if her vibes match what the Beatles are trying to do. So people are just kind of like, it's just like the vibes are weird, right? And Paul has said later, like, he really pulled back from John at this point because he felt like he caused John and Yoko getting together because he was getting along so well with Linda. Also, he was friends with Cynthia, John's first wife and now ex-wife, so he was upset because he's like, I like Cynthia. Awkward situation. March 12th, 1969, Linda and Paul get married. It's a small ceremony. None of the Beatles are there. Very, very low-key. 2 days later, Yoko and John are like, we should get married. So they go to Paris, can't get married there because you have to like reside. They can't get married in England because Yoko isn't a UK citizen. They go to Paris. They can't get married in Paris because you have to like reside in France for a certain amount of time. But then they find out for whatever reason they can get married in Gibraltar, which is a British territory in Spain, basically. Like, it's not in Spain because it's a British territory, but like, it's just Spain. We can accept that. So they fly to Gibraltar. All of this is in the Beatles song Ballad of John and Yoko. Maybe top 5 Beatles song for me. That song fucking rocks. I love that song. So they elope at Gibraltar Point and get married 8 days after Paul and Linda get married. They take these chic elopement pictures. I'm obsessed with these pictures. I think that this is, obviously, this elopement seems reactionary to Paul and Linda's marriage. You can't argue that this is not chic. Couple of things to note about this is that Yoko's divorce from her last husband was finalized in February, so they couldn't get married before then. I mean, the timeline is still like, did you have to try and get married 2 days after your best friend's wedding and then you couldn't, so you had to do it 8 days even though you wanted to do it earlier? I don't know. I couldn't find like actual concrete proof of this quote, but there's a lot of reference to this on McLennon blogs of Paul gets married, the news leaks, there's a newspaper heading that's like, Paul's wedding, and John X's out wedding and calls it Paul's funeral. If true, men will literally marry Yoko Ono in Gibraltar Point 8 days after their best friend's wedding instead of going to therapy. Let's talk about their relationship post-breakup, because obviously the relationship was kind of breaking down now. I've touched on it a little bit. Yoko didn't break up the Beatles. For sure, John and Paul did. Like, that's not even, I feel like, a new thought in the modern day. Like, if you've learned anything from this video, it's that they're unhinged, okay? So their creative relationship broke down, which we saw kind of starting on the White Album. They wanted to create different music and were fighting about it a lot. Paul pulled away from John because he felt responsible for him getting together with Yoko. John is acting out of pocket after Paul and Linda get together. Also, the whole time this is happening, George just seething under the surface. If you watch Get Back, he is so mad the whole time. He wants to fight Paul, but he's British, so he just has to be like, okay, wild. George is becoming a songwriter in his own right, but because of the previously established Lennon-McCartney songwriter relationship, he's really only allowed to get 1 or 2 songs on every album. And George has become a fantastic songwriter. Some of the greatest Beatles songs are written by George. He also has the best post-Beatles album. It's a triple album called All Things Must Pass with bop after bop on them. Run of the Mill, All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity? Lots of really beautiful songs kind of chronicling, honestly, the breakdown of this band. I'm obsessed. He also wrote Something, which is like, I think the most popular Beatles song of all time, Here Comes the Sun. George is pissed because he can't, like, he's seen as like their little brother and they just don't really respect him. So he also wants to break up. If you watch a lot of Beatles documentaries, they'll have footage of them signing the contracts to disband. And George is like skipping to sign the contract, like he's so excited. Also, Brian Epstein dies. They're not sure if it's from an accidental overdose or from suicide. Very, very sad. And because of that, they begin intense managerial disputes where Paul wants Linda's father, who's a businessman, to manage the band, and the rest of the Beatles want the Rolling Stones manager to manage the band. Paul is right in that the Rolling Stones manager is a massive crook and just wants to like steal their money, get them horrible deals. But the rest of the band are like, we literally don't want your girlfriend's dad managing us. So that they break down because of that. They basically decide to break up, go on hiatus, but it's kept under wraps. It's not official in paper or anything like that, because in September of 1969, John Lennon announces he's leaving the band. And this is kept a secret, under wraps. They're still kind of in contact. In January of 1970, John sends a postcard to Paul and Linda from him and Yoko. So like, we know that they're talking. I like to focus on this postcard because John spells Great Britain like Grate, like a cheese grater. And I'm like, babe, you are a writer. Can we at least attempt basic literacy, mama? So that's in January. On April 10th of 1970, Paul announces to the press he's leaving the band. So this angers John. John left the band first, and Paul's like, actually, press, I'm leaving the Beatles. Messy, messy, messy. They're upset. They don't talk for a while. Also, they're suing each other. The like manager from the Rolling Stones and John were selling off shares of the catalog of the Beatles that Paul didn't know about. It's a mess. It's a mess. I don't really think you care about the business side of it, but they have to like sue each other to fix it, even though it's not like inherently aggressive, if that makes sense. Very British. So that happens in 1970. 1971, both John and Paul release solo music about the other one. So let's talk about that. So 1971, Paul and Linda released Ram, an album, I'll Defend With My Life. That album is so good. Now, we don't know exactly what on Ram is in reference to John, but John responds very angrily to this record at the time and later talks about it, basically saying that it's in response to him and Yoko and that Paul put like secret messages in the lyrics that only John would understand. Okay? Very Gatsby of Paul McCartney. John starts writing the song How Do You Sleep, which is a song on his album Imagine. Imagine is the album, obviously, with his like famous song, the like, imagine there's no countries, I wonder if you can. But How Do You Sleep at Night is like, fuck you, Paul McCartney. I hope you die. I'm gonna drown you in your own blood, bitch. It is a cold-hearted diss track. Like, it isn't Not Like Us coded, where he doesn't call Paul a sex criminal, but it feels like it stops there. So let's read some of the lyrics for this, because it is wild. So Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise. They have an album called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club. You better see right through that mother's eyes. Those freaks was right when they said you was dead. There's a conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney died, and that's why he's shoeless on the cover of Abbey Road. The one mistake was in your head. How do you sleep? How do you sleep at night? You live with straights who tell you you was the king. Jump when your mama tells you anything. The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you're gone, you're just another day. A pretty face may last a year or two, but pretty soon they'll see what you can do. The sound you make is music to my ear, like background music. You must have learned something in all those years. How do you sleep? How do you sleep at night? So kind of like, some would say a very aggressive kind of cornered rat of a song, of being like, oh, you wrote Ram with your wife. Well, how the do you sleep at night? Yeah, you might be pretty, but I'm not in a gay way. I'm not gay. You're just pretty, but it's gonna fade, bitch. Crazy. I'll include it. I don't think I can play the song. There is a documentary about John Lennon writing Imagine, and they have clips in this of him cutting this song, like recording this song. And George, who's pissed at Paul at this point because Paul was always like big dogging him when they were recording albums, being like, just play it regular, stop being fancy on the guitar. So George is pissed at Paul, ripping it on the guitar on this track. Like, you can see John singing, being like, how do you sleep at night? And George is like, like messy, messy, messy. So that's like, I feel like that's in like September or October. I don't remember exactly. I don't have it written, but of 1971. And in December of 1971, Paul releases Dear Friend, which he recorded during the Ram sessions. So it was recorded before How Do You Sleep, but is released after How Do You Sleep. And I would argue the lyrics are nicer. Dear friend, throw the wine. I'm in love with a friend of mine. Really, truly, young and newlywed. Are you a fool, or is it true? Oh, are you afraid, or is it true? Dear friend, what's the time? Is this really the borderline? Does it really mean so much to you? Are you afraid, or is it true? So this feels like a more complicated musing on their relationship. But in general, I said this before when we were talking about the Paris trip of 1961, a lot of Paul's songs about him and John seem to be musing on these better times, while John seems to be like actively metabolizing hurt and lashing out. So also during the breakup, that's when the Lost Weekend happens, when he has an 18-month separation, John does, from Yoko Ono. He starts dating May Pang, who is the couple's assistant. Yoko sits May down and is like, I think you should have an affair with John. I give you permission. Just keep me updated. I want to work on my art. Bye. And she said that this is because of all the hate she received after the Beatles broke up, of everyone being like, you broke up the Beatles, you should die. So that's what's happening. Also, if you look at photos of May Pang, cool girl. Like, she looks awesome. Side note, okay? So May Pang said of the Lost Weekend of John, he was always saying, I wonder what Paul is doing. When John and I were together, and this is about a week or two before our relationship ended, I remember him saying, do you think I should write with Paul again? I said, absolutely. You should, because you want to. The two of you as solo performers are good, but together you can't be beaten. And on March 28th of 1974, Paul and John run into each other at a recording studio in Burbank and like jam for like 40 minutes on the guitar. And people are like, it's amazing. So this is kind of like a moment of reconnection during John's Lost Weekend. They're like, let's go to New Orleans, bestie trip, Paris 2.0. We're going to New Orleans and we'll write a bit. And then Yoko calls John up and is like, hey, I found a hypnotherapist for you in New York because I know you want to quit smoking. And John's like, work, let's go. He goes to this hypnotherapist to help him quit smoking. I feel like my makeup has run underneath my eyes from sadness. Gets back together with Yoko, breaks up with May Pang, and cancels on Paul on the trip. And McLennon shippers posit, there's no real way to, I don't think, to concretely prove this in the modern day, that hypnotherapist also did conversion therapy. Awesome. That's sad. Now let's move on to the assassination of John Lennon. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon is shot outside of the Dakota Apartments, which is his home in New York City. I'm not going to go into this too much. Yes, the assassin was mentally ill, but killing someone is such like loser shit. Like, it's just, I don't want to give it more airtime because he obviously killed John Lennon to be famous. Like, do you know what I mean? I understand that he was mentally ill, but I don't think we need to like talk about him, you know? All you need to know is John was signing autographs outside of the Dakota with Yoko. He gets shot and dies on the scene. The Inquirer puts a photo of his dead body on the front page. Okay, it's giving TMZ, like, chill out. It should be illegal, right? Like, you'd think that's got to be illegal. There are reports that a lot of McLennon shippers point to, not all, but some, that on the day John was dying, he was wearing a button that says, "I love Paul," which is like, it's like a kind of vintage Beatle merch that when the Beatles were touring, girls, assumedly, would buy buttons that'd be like, "I love George. I love Ringo." You know what I mean? To be like, you get it, right? So John was wearing an "I love Paul" button, gets shot, and as he's dying, he touches his heart where the button is and like dies. It is not true. I mean, obviously I wasn't there. I did not time travel back in time to witness the assassination of John Lennon, because let's just say this, if I was there, things would have gone a little differently. Okay? Was that Mark Wahlberg who said that about 9/11? That's how I feel about John Lennon's assassination. If I was at John Lennon's assassination, never would have happened on my watch. I wasn't born in 1980, so I couldn't have stopped it, but if I was, I would have stopped it. So we can't know for sure, but like, there's literally no reference to this anywhere. In the news, in anybody's biographies, anything like that. The closest reference I can get to it is Harry Nilsson, who he did like an American songbook. He's a folk singer, very, very good friends with John Lennon, said in, I believe it was his book or in an interview, that John would wear an "I love Paul" button. Like, not as like a joke, but you know how people do stuff like ironically or whatever. He did have one and he would wear it like on his suit. I can't find a picture of him actually wearing it, but here's him wearing buttons. So like, just imagine with your brain, right? And one time when they were walking down the street, a girl stopped John and was like, "Why are you wearing an 'I love Paul' button?" And he was like, "'Cause I love Paul." So again, there's no way to know if their love is like friends, brotherly, romantic, but it is complicated, okay? All that's to say is the story of him touching his "I love Paul" button before he dies is probably not true. The next day after John is assassinated, reporters corner Paul on a street to be like, "What do you think about John dying?" You know, normal, how you treat somebody who's actively grieving. Just kind of corner them and be like, "What do you think of the death of your friend that you probably thought that you had years and years to work it out on the remix when you're like 70 years old? You probably thought you had a lot of time to eventually like wrap up the complicated nature of your relationship, but now you don't because he was assassinated." Do you have any thoughts about that? So they are like, "What do you think?" And Paul says, "It's a drag," which people are get mad at him at, understandably. I mean, he's in shock. This is a horrific thing that's happened. Like, you know, anyways, he walks back on this and then says, "It's a terrible tragedy. I'll miss him. He's one of my greatest friends." But, you know, you often hear stories of people referencing when Paul hears that John Lennon dies going, "It's a drag." And it's like, no, he was like cornered on the street and it was like literally the day after it happened, and it happened like late at night, you know? Paul's sister said, this is a quote, but it's a complicated quote, so walk with me while I explain who everyone is in it. In the week after Lennon's death, Andy Peoples, who had interviewed John just before he died, was contacted by George Martin, who is a music producer, okay? So Andy Peoples gets a call from George Martin. So Paul wanted the interviewer to come to the studio to meet with him and got the music producer, George Martin, to ask him. I had to decipher this quote, right? So this interviewer comes to the studio and says, so this is Peebles talking, okay? "Forgive me, Paul, if I got this wrong, but what Paul wanted me to tell him was that John still loved him." So he has his interviewer come, who interviewed John before he died, brings him into the studio to be like, "Did John still love me?" And Paul, "Well, call me crazy, but he lost the wife. I'm certainly not implying anything of a carnal nature here, but to almost all intents and purposes, as John would have put it, what they had was a marriage. John and Paul were meant to meet, meant to create, and one was designed to play Sturm and Drang to the other's yin and yang." So it's really sad to kind of imagine, I talked about this a little bit in the joke of them cornering Paul on the street, but like it's obvious to me, and I think about it a lot when I think about the death of Liam Payne and his complicated relationship with Zayn Malik. And obviously it's a little different because while they did create, like, the relationship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon was a very, very intense creative one. But this idea of you have these relationships with people and you think that you have a lot of time to girl so confusing work it out. You can say, well, we're not friends now, but me and John will work it out in like 20 years. And then that relationship gets cut short because that person dies and you don't know what to do with all those complicated feelings. It's very sad. So in 1982, 2 years after John's death, Paul releases Here Today. It's about John and captures grief really beautifully. And if I said I really knew you well, what would your answer be if you were here today, here today? Well, knowing you, you'd probably laugh and say that we were worlds apart if you were here today, here today. But as for me, I still remember how it was before, and I'm holding back the tears no more. Oh, I love you. Oh. What about the time we met? Well, I suppose you could say that we were playing hard to get, didn't understand a thing, but we could always sing. What about the night we cried? Because there wasn't any reason left to keep it all inside. We never understood a word, but you were always there with a smile. And if I say I really loved you and was glad you came along, then you were here today, for you were in my song, Here Today. Sorry to make the saddest video known to mankind. That's on me. Okay, to wrap up this video, I want to talk about Now and Then, which is the song the Beatles released in 2023 with AI. You might have remembered this being kind of in the news. The song is fine. It's not that great, but they basically were able to clean up John's vocals, which were recorded on a tape recorder, so that they could release it. Because they recorded it in like 1995. Let me walk you through the story. Let me walk you through it. It makes more sense if I tell you in order. So Now and Then is an unfinished demo that John recorded before he died. He recorded it in his apartment at the Dakota on a tape recorder. It's like the equivalent of like using voice notes. I love I'm explaining to Gen Z voice notes in a tape recorder. But you basically just record it at home so then you can go in the studio and make it actually sound good because it's in the past. So microphones were but he died, couldn't finish it. Yoko finds it, gives it to Paul and Ringo and George, and is like, maybe you can do something with it. They're working on the Beatles anthology project to like, for their legacy. George is still alive at this time, so they record all their parts, finish the song, but they don't release it because George is like, John's part sounds so shit. Like, it doesn't sound good. We can't release this. But in 2023, with AI, random AI win, I guess AI is fine and everything that it does that's bad is okay. AI is able to clean up the vocals and finish them so that they can release the song. Okay? Now, the song kind of tells a story of like an absent lover and loss. Let me read you some of the lyrics. I know it's true. It's all because of you. And if I make it through, it's all because of you. And now and then, if we must start again, well, we will know for sure that I will love you. Now and then I miss you. Now and then. I want you to be there for me. Always to return to me. Okay? Great. But, on April 23rd, 1976, Paul visits the Dakota to see John. This is their last in-person conversation before John dies 4 years later. As Paul is leaving, John's last words to Paul in person are, think of me every now and then, old friend. And then John writes the song Now and Then. We don't know, obviously after Paul leaves, we don't know when, but the last Beatles song is an unfinished John Lennon song with the same words as John Lennon's last in-person words to Paul McCartney. Tinfoil hat. I mean, their actual last conversation was on the phone and they were talking about baking bread, but that's not narratively fulfilling as this, okay? So in conclusion, we'll never know the kind of love that they have for each other, but I do think the tale is really interesting, especially when you think about it in the context of modern shipping, and like, it's kind of like the OG of the gay ships of now, but it's the gay ships of yore. I think it's interesting. I think it's beautiful. I think it's really beautiful, and the book Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow touches on this, but I truly think to play and create with someone is the most vulnerable and some of the strongest relationships you can have with people. And I think, masculinity is a prison, especially in like the 1960s. Like, it's tough. So I think it's really interesting. And I want to thank the McLennon shippers for allowing me to go down this rabbit hole. I found it so interesting. And whether or not it's true, and it's not if Paul McCartney is watching this, it's not, girl, don't worry about it. It's a really beautiful story about loss, regardless. And I wanted to make this video, even though I feel like nobody cares about this but me. I will leave you with two different quotes, one from Paul and one from John, about their relationships before we wrap it up. So John said in an interview to Playboy in 1980, It's like a love affair. When you first meet, you can have the hots 24 hours a day for each other, but after 15 or 20 years, a different kind of sexual and intellectual relationship develops, right? It's still love, but it's different. So there's a kind of difference in creativity too. As in a love affair, two creative people can destroy themselves trying to recapture that youthful spirit at 21 or 24 of creating without even being aware of how it's happening. After John's death in 1985, Paul goes on a German talk show and says, I think really what it was, really all that happened was that John fell in love with Yoko. And so with such a powerful alliance like that, it was difficult for him to still be seeing me. It was as if I was another girlfriend almost. Our relationship was a strong relationship. And if he has to start a new relationship, he had to put his other one away. And I understand that. I couldn't stand in the way of someone who'd fallen in love. You can't say, who's this? You really can't do that. In this case, I just sort of said, right. I didn't say anything, but I could see that was the way it was going to go and that Yoko would be very sort of powerful for him. So we all had to get out of the way. I don't blame her, You can't blame her for being the object of his love. Wow. This is like not really that funny of a video. It's just interesting. Sometimes I just like to give the vibe of like, we're on FaceTime and you're like, hey, I just wanted to like iron out the plans for tonight. And I'm like, love that actually, but I need to tell you all about how John Lennon and Paul McCartney were allegedly maybe in love. Okay, so thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all of the people online who were able to help kind of keep all this information together. Tumblr is such an internet archive. I'm obsessed. And if you want to know more about the Beatles, you can listen to our podcast episode. We did like 5 episodes about the Beatles, and they're very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Bye.